Hey everyone! So today you and I are going to talk about coding practices. So let's get into it. Now, there is a little bit of a predicament in talking about coding practices because you kind of have to define what do you mean by a coding practice. Well, my definition of a coding practice is basically just a set of rules that you at your company kind of agree on, and it's something that you want to do as a company. It's basically just a joint effort for you guys to write consistent code that is fairly easy to understand, and you just kind of agree on that this is the way things should work. Now, then there are named coding practices or best practices, which are styles of coding like object-oriented programming, functional programming, and there are ways of solving problems, basically a style of problem solving, if you will. And those are the two that, at least the two major ones that I kind of think about when I say a coding practice. And the reason why I want to talk to you about this is that there are those of you out there, or you're going to at some point get to a point where these things starts to matter a lot to you. And I will argue that it most likely is going to go this way. It's going to start with that you don't think so much about it, and then you're going to care a lot about it, and then you're going to not care so much about it, and then finally when you are a little bit more senior, you will start caring about it again, but for a very different reason. So just let me just walk you through it. The first thing that's going to happen is that you are going to just focus on writing software at all, being able to produce code of any quality, so that the program does what it needs to be doing. The second thing that's going to happen is that you are going to be a philosopher. You're going most likely to be the sort of person, when you feel secure in your coding skills, you're going to start being philosophical with code, and you're going to try to adhere to good practices, best practices. You're going to say the word refactor 100 times at every job, basically, whenever you see somebody who has not solved the problem in as a perfect way that they could have. So what I wanted to touch on here is basically, what if you just stop yourself there for a moment and you think about what you're actually when you get that urge to refactor something and make it a little bit nicer, just stop for a moment and think about it. What are the what's the possible reason as to why somebody didn't write this in as nice a way that you know how to write? Because you've read most likely some books by Martin Fowler and Uncle Bob. Maybe you've read some best practices books or different types of literature that will tell you how to actually write code, and it's written by people who are much smarter than your colleagues, by a lot. Some of the most respected programmers in the world have been part of writing these books. So why aren't you doing this? Because when you're going to go and talk to your colleagues, they're going to say that, yeah, that could probably be a good idea, and they're still not going to do it. And if you start doing it, they're going to tell you most likely that there are more important things to worry about. So what's going on here? Why aren't they writing this best practices style of code that you have read in books is so valuable? Well, here's why. Because of the same reason we have cars that are not made by Ferrari or one of the major car companies or the luxury brands. It's the same reason why we have phones that are not made by, say, Apple or whatever. Because the issue with perfection and best practices is that it's very costly to do so, and you have to kind of realize that a lot of these best practices are created in a very generic fashion. Think of it as a losing weight diet. Most of the different trend dieting styles and so forth are basically accustomed or they're generalized to the general population, but they cannot possibly be perfect for every single individual who wants to go on a diet. Some people like high fat, low carbs. Some people go high carbs. There's so many different ways, and it kind of boils down to you to figure out what's a good fit for you. And this is the same situation, because if you adhere to every single best practice that is out there, you're actually going to find that you produce even worse code. The code is actually going to be worse. Trust me, you may not believe it, but I used to do this, and trust me, the results were not good. I was actually scolded by my teacher at one point, and he said the code was absolute rubbish, even though I had adhered to every single best practice that there was, at least from my definition of these best practices. So what's going to happen is that you are either going to be a philosopher and you're going to ignore what I'm saying completely now, and that's okay. You are allowed to, because you know best. And what's going to happen then is that you are going to burn your fingers over and over and over and get really, really tired that every time you try to jump into that refactor, you're going to figure out that there's all these problems, and you're going to realize that you cannot actually make the thing nicer. You can't. And then finally you're going to get back and you're going to start not thinking so much about practices. You're going to hack things together, that sort of thing. Most likely you're going to be let's call it a pragmatic master, if you will. You're going to learn that sometimes you can make something a little bit nicer, and most of the time you're going to just have to make it work. And then finally you will get to the stage where you are truly ready to start leading and taking a part in project level discussions about coding practices. This is where you want to be. It's where you have realized that coding practices and so forth are designed to allow you and your team to agree on a set of rules that makes sense to you, that makes your specific project in your specific circumstances, to make all of that make sense to you. In your use case, I'll try to challenge your perception of this as much as I can and say, what if you had, this is actually a true story. An old colleague of mine actually questioned the reason why you would want to use a database, for example, as such a fundamental thing like a database. And the reason he was questioning it, because back in the day when he was working at the previous company, they had actually figured out a much more a use case that was actually better. It was actually better for them to use the file system. They didn't even they had storage. They made their own storage implementation, their own storage system. I'm not going to go into much exactly how it works because I might get it wrong, but they had actually found that they didn't need a database. Imagine that. How many times do you think that happens? Not that often, and it's kind of cool that a company can make such a radical decision on what type of practices that they want to follow at their job. It's the same thing that will happen at your job. You're going to figure out that some things that you have been told by books and people like public speakers and so forth, that these rules that they give you, although they are good in general, good thoughts to have, they might not actually be a good fit for your specific case. And that's what you want to be. You want to be the person who can determine when a good best practice actually is a best practice for you, and when it's not, and when you have to do your own thing. And trust me, it's a healthy mix of these two. So I urge you to kind of think about these things. And the one thing I can tell you is that don't sweat it if you make this mistake, because this is an experience type of thing. All I can really tell you is that you will get to a point in terms of experience where you start to actually feel the words that I'm telling you most likely now, and you're going to understand what I am telling you, hopefully. Maybe you're already there, but until then, try to have this mindset. Best practices and all that stuff are not religious rules. They are guidelines. Have a great day.